Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight we're going to the Roman arena. And the main character of the night isn't Maximus, isn't Spartacus. It's the Gladiatrix, the female gladiators almost no one talks about. Yet they existed stubbornly, like a thorn in the heel of history. You've seen them on movie posters. Muscles like Apollo, sweat so shiny it looks photoshopped with olive oil. But have you ever imagined a bare-chested woman, armored legs, standing in red sand, not to seduce but to survive? Before we begin, if this really feels like a comforting place to hide late at night, hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. Like the rule in an ancient tavern, you only stay if you need a place to be quiet. And you know what I love the most? Looking at the comments, seeing where you're from and what time it is. Whether it's New York or Norway, 1 in the morning or 5, you're still here. And I see you. Now turn off the lights, turn on a little fan if you have one. Not because it's hot, but for that soft humming sound. You wake up early, very early. Not because you like mornings, but because women in Rome aren't allowed to sleep in. Whoever you are, slave's daughter or nobleman's niece, there's always a man waiting for you to do something. If you're noble, you're bound by parties, glances, and the reputation of an entire bloodline. You eat better, dress nicer, but every move you make must fit the standard of a proper Roman lady. No yawning while seated, no speaking too much, and always a gentle nod when a man enters the room. You are an ancient vase on display, beautiful, valuable, fragile, and never allowed to choose your own place on the shelf. If you're a slave, you have no last name, no day off, no defender. You're spoken of like an object, and if someone touches you without your consent, the law won't ask you. They'll ask your owner if he wants to file a complaint. You have no voting rights, no government positions. You can't sue anyone unless a man accompanies you. And of course, you can't go to war. Roman men call you mulieres, women, not feminae, ladies, because feminae are for the respected ones. And you're just a tiny name in a carefully edited family tree. If you marry, you belong to your husband. If you're unmarried, you belong to your father. If your father dies, you belong to your uncle or brother. In short, you never belong to yourself. You might be able to read, you might be able to write. But if you write too honestly, like Sulpicia, they'll say you're no longer decent. You might fall in love, but love the wrong person, and the whole city will say you've lost your reputation, even if you're just living like a human. In ancient Rome, a woman's reputation mattered more than her life, and ironically, that reputation isn't built by you, but by what others say. A single rumor could break your entire life. A glance at the wrong time could have you called improper. Reputation in Rome didn't need evidence, just enough people furrowing their brows while saying your name. You mustn't cry too loud, mustn't laugh too big, mustn't walk outside alone, mustn't talk back when insulted. Because everything you do reflects on the man who owns you. So you're like a statue, placed in the house to represent virtue, but never allowed to speak. You are jewelry with a heartbeat, a display that breathes. Every step, every smile, every bow of the head must be calculated, as if you're the liveliest piece of furniture in a man's home, taught to become someone's wife, praised if you know how to stay silent at the right moment. But what if one day you wake up, same hair, same cold meal, but you no longer want to be quiet? You no longer want to be the shadow behind. You want to hear your name screamed from the crowd. You want your sweat to soak the sand, not the napkin on the dining table. Then you've started something strange, something dangerous, something Roman society calls shameless, and something that will lead you toward the arena. You've trained. You've learned how to block, to fall with control, to twist your wrist so the sword doesn't tremble when you strike. You've learned how to stare into your enemy's eyes and not blink. But the first thing people look at is still your appearance. You aren't allowed to wear armor like men. No chest plate, no shoulder metal. Because they think armor makes you look too manly. And women, they say, should fight aesthetically. Some even make you go fully topless, like the male gladiators, but not for combat effectiveness, because it makes the crowd more satisfied. Just a loincloth, a sword, and your legs must be proportionate. Did you know? In the Roman arena, a calf muscle could be entertainment. The crowd came not just for blood, they came for the body. And you, even as a warrior, were seen as a spectacle. Your body was the opening act. Your death, only the finale. You're told to be impressive, but not too masculine. Be strong, but don't forget to be graceful. If you win, the crowd claps. But if you win and don't look good, they'll gossip behind your back about how you walk. Some might even suggest you be benched, not because you're weak, but because you're no longer appealing on stage. Your victory might be enough to save your life, but not enough to keep the role if your posture is seen as too rough. Because in Roman eyes, even if a woman stabs someone with a sword, she should still be sexy. You might take on a stage name like Amazon or Achillea. Those names sound like praise, but also serve as an excuse to turn you into a costume game. You don't stand on sand, you stand on stage. Every movement must be both combat-worthy and charming. The lights shine down from the high seats, and you learn to stand where scars don't show, where shadows fall just right. You hold the sword, but the audience holds the power. You fight, but they decide if you're worth surviving. And sometimes, a well-timed glance from the crowd can save you from death. So you learn to use your body like a second language. A tilt of the torso can distract. A half smile can delay an enemy's strike. A well-placed chin lift can make the crowd clap. You're not just a warrior. You're an actress, a diplomat, a performance artist. On a stage where if you mess up the role, you don't just lose the part, you lose your life. You're not allowed to enter the arena. That's what the law says. In the year 11 AD, the Roman Senate issued a decree. Free women under the age of 20, banned from participating in blood sports. They said it was for morality, because women should be protected from blood, from blades, from the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd. But really, they just wanted you out of the light. You're not allowed to enter the arena, but no one forbids you from crossing the line. You see an inscription carved in Ostia, the port city near Rome. Judge Hostilianus permits women to fight. Not feminae, but mulieres, those who don't belong to the noble class. Because noble women aren't allowed to step into that blood-soaked place, their family's reputation couldn't withstand the smell of sweat and steel. But if you're poor, no one cares where you die. If you're a slave, you have no laws protecting you. You have only one chance: earn the crowd's gaze or disappear forgotten. Emperor Septimius Severus also tried to ban you. In 200 AD, he decreed, "No woman shall enter the arena. He feared you'd demand to compete in the Olympics. He feared your bare arms lifting weights instead of hems. He didn't say it, but he feared one simple thing. You would no longer be obedient. But you know what? The law can't touch a soul that knows what freedom is. You might be a slave, sold. You might be a commoner, nameless. But if you choose the arena, no one can call you weak anymore. And so, you begin to train. Not in an official gladiator school, because women aren't accepted, but in the grass behind the house, or in your father's forge. He was once a gladiator, now a blacksmith. And when night falls, when Rome sleeps, you hear the blade strike stone, like someone refusing to submit. No banners, no slogans, just a quiet hand drawing a sword every night. Not to rebel, but to remind herself she's still alive and still has a choice. You don't do it to become a legend. You do it because you don't want anyone else deciding for you when to fall, when to stand, when to live. The law may block your hand, but it can't block that desire, because the law can be carved into stone, but the soul is etched in blood. You think the arena is only about blood? You're not wrong, but you're not completely right. Gladiator games, called munera, weren't born for entertainment. At first, they were funerary rituals, a religious duty for the dead. But people quickly discovered, spilling blood in front of a crowd sells more tickets than sacrificing in silence. A nobleman dies. His heirs hold a funeral. Instead of just mourning, they hire a few people to fight. Instead of flowers, they offer blood. The idea was, the dead would rest in peace if someone bled in their name. Sounds unsanitary, but very Roman. Then the public started watching. They began to enjoy it. So the noble families made it grander. From 2 people brawling on the ground to full-on performances in the square. As the empire grew, everything bloomed. Each battle was directed. There was a script, characters, costumes. There was even a team of trainers, writers, and lighting coordinators. You didn't just have to strike. You had to strike when the drum hit. And if the spotlight missed its mark, the whole fight might be rated as emotionally flat. There were even mythological themes. You'd have to play an Amazon, facing off against a male dressed as Achilles. And if you were a woman, the crowd would be especially curious. Matches with gladiatrixes were often advertised as special acts, as if you weren't a person, but an event. You became a highlight, not because of your skills, but because your gender was strange in a space made for blood and men. You might play a heretic, a fallen goddess, a vengeful spirit. A gladiator was a warrior, but also an actor. And if you were a woman, that doubled. You didn't just fight, you had to convince the crowd you were performing. If you were too strong, they said you were too masculine. If you were too soft, they said you lacked fire. So you learned to walk off the stage like you didn't need anyone to clap. Many matches didn't end in death. If you knelt, raised your hand, and the crowd was pleased, you could be spared. It's called missio, pardon on the sand. But you know this, mercy isn't in your hands. It lies in whether you made them, want you to live. Sometimes the killing was just a backdrop. The bigger question, did you leave behind a beautiful image when you died? Blood can be washed off. Reputation cannot. You don't wake up one morning, put on a loincloth and declare, I'm going to be a gladiatrix. No, you must be trained, very seriously, very painfully, and very alone. The gladiator training system, called ludus, had existed since 105 BC. But sorry, women weren't allowed to register as official students. So if you're a gladiatrix, you have to find your own path. You're trained by your father, if he was once a gladiator, or you hire a private lanista, an off-the-books trainer, or you learn in secret. After the laundry is done, after the men are asleep, no weights, no gym, just wooden swords, straw, dust, and bruises. You eat rations, mostly beans, barley, and a bit of honey, not to keep you strong, but to puff your belly, hiding the bruises. They don't want the audience to see you weak, but they also don't want you to die too soon. You're a bleeding investment, not an invincible warrior. What do they teach you? Not how to strike, but how to survive, in a fighting style chosen for you based on height and body type. If you're short, quick, you might be trained as a retiarius, using nets and tridents, relying on speed and trickery. If you've got broad shoulders, muscle, you'll be a mumillo, with short sword and large shield, slow but powerful. No one asks who you want to be. You're just a piece in a play. And if you're a woman, they usually cast you as graceful, flexible, so the crowd finds you easier to watch. You must survive, in the exact way they think you're fit to be killed. How to read an opponent's counterattack from their eyes. How to puff your chest just enough to hide old bruises without tearing fresh scars. How to slip without breaking your knee. How to fall loudly without snapping your neck. You fall 10 times a day, not because you lose, but so the crowd remembers your face. A perfect fall might help you live one more week. Fall too stiff, they call you emotionless. Fall too soft, they say you're a bad actress. You must fall just right, to stir pity without overacting. How to make the blood drip just right from your forehead, for a nice "oh" from the stands. And you must learn to perform. Look up. Flex your abs at the right moment. Lift your chin so the light catches your blood, for a perfect shot. All of it is trained, not to make you stronger, but to make the crowd believe you're worth keeping. You have no teammates, no emotional coach. Just one rule: how you fall decides how you live. You train until the blade no longer feels cold, until your sweat mixes with arena dust, forming a grey crust on your arms. And one day, you no longer blink when someone raises a sword to your neck. You're not ready, but no one asks you that. There is only one question: can you enter the arena without trembling? Don't believe the movies. Not everyone who steps into the arena dies. At least, not immediately. You stand on the sand. Golden dust sticks to your thighs like someone else's makeup. Facing you is a stranger, also shaking, also holding a wooden sword wrapped in metal. Neither of you wants to die. Both of you know, death is not in your hands. The fight begins. You don't know if your opponent ate well, don't know if their sword is as sharp as yours. Maybe they hold a dull blade to lose quickly. Maybe you have to fight someone armored, while you only have a loincloth and bare hands. Weapons aren't always real, and never fair. It's not as fast as in the movies. No soundtrack, no slow motion, just breaths and bones hitting each other. You remember the old lesson: fall first, moan softly, bleed little. If you perform well, you'll be spared. The crowd doesn't like blood flying everywhere. They like the feeling of holding life and death in their hands. If you kneel, raise a hand to surrender. The sponsor, Munirarius, looks at the crowd. Sometimes he says nothing, just twists his thumb, drawing an arc in the air. No one taught you what to understand, but you do. For a long time in Rome, death has been gestured. If the crowd thumbs down, you die. If they hold their thumbs sideways or ambiguous, you have a chance to live. But it's not certain. Never certain. Sometimes you knock down your opponent. You look down. They don't raise their head, don't raise their hand, don't speak. And you know what to do. One strike, decisive. Because if you hesitate, the crowd will boo. The sponsor will remember your name, and not in a good way. Winning doesn't make you live longer. It just gives you another match. Many die in the first fight. Some survive 10. Very few live long enough to retire. As for female gladiators, those who survive long enough to be named like Amazon or Achillea can be counted on one hand. Most are just nameless corpses drying in the sand. You have no tombstone, no bronze statue, just a bloodstain once dried, never spoken of again. And if you are a woman, the crowd is more curious, but not necessarily kinder. They judge how you hold your sword, how you fall, how you moan. They remember how your hair flew when you were struck. They won't remember your name. Fighting in the Roman arena is not to win. It's to keep your life by pleasing the crowd. You survive not because you're skilled, but because you're fashionable. You don't leave an autobiography. No one asks how you felt after the fight. No talk shows behind the arena scenes. No celebrities react to your slash. But you leave traces. On stone. A 2nd century relief found in Turkey, carving 2 women, Achillea and Amazon. Both hold swords, carry shields. Ready stance, but not afraid. Below, the inscription reads, "Stands misses," meaning both were spared because the fight was even. No one won, no one died. Both were good enough to live. No blood, no wounds. Just facing each other, like a silent tragedy. Some say this was Rome's way to honor a fight with no winner. On ash. An ancient crematorium, a few pelvic bones, and dozens of oil lamps found in London. The woman was buried like a true gladiator. No one knows her name, but someone lit lamps, dozens, around her ashes. They celebrated, they commemorated, they remembered a female warrior who left the arena. On ceramic, a small shard, maybe a pendant, inscribed Veracunda Ludia, Lucius Gladiator. Short. Maybe she was a female gladiator, maybe just the lover of a gladiator. People still debate. Some scholars say it was a ticket to a show. Others say it was an Instagram of the ancient times, where love, blood, and sweat were condensed into one line of carving. Whatever it was, that shard remains, longer than any rumor, while her flesh and screams do not. They left no words, only a stance, a name carved on stone, a sword touching the earth, a gaze engraved, never knowing if anyone ever looked back. Maybe future generations don't remember them for glory, but the scars they left on culture cannot be erased. They say, carving your name in stone is to be remembered forever, but no one promises to read it. And those women, named or not, live again, every time someone looks closely at an old piece of stone. They didn't write diaries, they didn't post podcasts, but they left things harder to erase. Comments. The Roman historians all men, and they were uncomfortable when women held swords. Juvenal. The Roman satirist once wrote, "The wife wearing an iron helmet, groaning from tired arms, learning to stab like a novice soldier. Would you be proud of her belt and greaves?" No, that was not praise. It was a sneer. And he went further. He described sweat grieves, groans during training, then concluded, "She's no different from a man, just smaller and more tired." When a man feels tired from seeing a strong woman, they often call it loss of virtue. Tacitus was more disappointed. Writing from the perspective of the Roman nobility, where honor was more valuable than gold, he saw women entering the arena like pouring fine wine into a pigsty. It confused him, not because of morality, but because women began choosing their own path. That sentence, translated to modern times, sounds like, "She's pathetic, choosing to be herself." Cassius Dio went even further. He wrote around 200 AD, when women fighting in the arena was still a wrinkle in the empire's mind. He detailed, "Some women killed wild beasts, some wrote poetry, some played lyres, some hacked at others." The tone was like a sensational evening news report. All said with one voice, they should stay home. Rome didn't ban strong women. They just preferred strong women within men's limits. She could be sharp, as long as only sharp at the dinner table. She could be smart, as long as she used that wit to bear sons. But if she held a sword, she became a problem to be rewritten. No lines from female gladiators survive. All we know about them comes from men's mouths, and men often don't tell the whole truth. They tell what confuses them or threatens them. But because of those judgments, we know they existed. Just like now, more than 2,000 years later, women are still asked, "Are you maybe a little too strong? Are you trying to prove something?" And the answer is always, "No, I'm just trying to live." What existence is more obvious than making an empire speak out? You know, today, people really love talking about gladiators. They wear armor in movies. They appear in AAA games. There's even a Lego Gladiator Maximus set, and no shortage of TikTok videos with the caption, "Live like a Roman, train like a gladiator." But most forget one small thing. Women were there too, not in the stands, not as waiting wives, but as opponents. Yet, in most Hollywood movies, female gladiators, if they appear, are seductive exceptions. They fight like fire dancers, no sweat, no bruises. In Spartacus, Gladiator, or recently Barbarians, female gladiators, if they appear, are usually exceptionally made up. They fight like fire dancers, beautiful, cold, silent, and usually not breathing hard. If you try to find a female gladiator actually listed in textbooks, you'll find only Amazon and Achillea, and that's it. No, risk of broken spines. The reality is, they scream, they slip and fall, they clench their jaws, and they often die faster than men, because less armor and more prejudice. Modern scholars are starting to take this topic seriously again. Inscriptions, statues, ashes are gradually re-examined with less bias. For example, in 1996, in the Great Dover area of London, archaeologists found a strange female tomb. Not intact, only ashes and a pelvis. But next to it were expensive oil lamps, signs of lavish feasting, and even a burned pine cone. Pine cones, often burned after battles to purify the arena. That woman, unnamed, was sent off like someone who lived with weapons. Maybe she didn't hold a sword, but everything around her said someone remembered her as a gladiator. And as female voices start emerging in archaeology, people also begin to see there's not just one way to live as a gladiator. Maybe you don't need to hold a sword. Maybe you just need to hold tight to your right to exist In a world wanting you gone, maybe you're not in the Colosseum arena, but you're fighting every day against judgment, limits, soft but tight expectations. And when we look back at women who once stood on Rome's hot sand, we don't see them as different. We just see them arriving too early. We learn about Spartacus, about Commodus, about grand battles where men roar like lions. But popular history falls silent when mentioning women on the sand. They're erased from paintings, textbooks, even cartoons. Not because they didn't exist, but because we don't know how to tell the story when the hero has braids. You know what's more exhausting than holding a sword? Arguing with a Latin professor about the word ludia. Gladiatrix, a name that sounds as cool as a female superhero, never appeared in classical Latin. It was coined by modern scholars in the 19th century. Before that, if you were a woman fighting in the arena, you were called by a vaguer term, ludia. And sometimes, mulieres, meaning women in general, instead of the more formal feminae, reserved for ladies, respectable women. That means, even if they wielded swords, spilled blood, and fought like anyone else, they were still not quite linguistically dignified enough to be named properly. A name, sometimes, is the border between history and oblivion. The problem is, ludia could also mean actress, or a gladiator's girlfriend, or a half-time singer. So for decades, scholars fell into a state of, we can't be sure, so let's just pretend they don't exist. Some conservatives insisted, there is no clear evidence, it's all misunderstanding. While others, more patient, said, it's unclear, but repeated often enough, it's worth listening to. The modern debate really flared up in the early 21st century, when multiple inscriptions and busts were found in Ostia and London. Scholars like Alison Futrell, Kathleen Coleman, began asking, how many women have we overlooked because we don't see the word gladiatrix? And the academic quarrel began. Camp A, no word gladiatrix, no women. Camp B, so does the elephant know it's called an elephant? Some even asked a bigger question. If Roman society allowed female gladiators, why didn't they record details? The answer might lie in classical prejudice. Writing about women holding swords means admitting something unusual existed. And history, you know, is usually what men want to keep. Sometimes we find physical evidence, like statues, reliefs, inscriptions. But even then, voices rise in seminars. Maybe she was just holding a ladle. And so Gladiatrix, though truly bloody, still has to fight once more, this time in the library. Their lives are debated not because they weren't real, but because their truth doesn't fit the lecture hall's framework. Maybe you never saw a gladiatrix in your history textbooks, but if you ever saw a female scholar standing before an ancient building, patiently pointing at a chip-nosed statue and saying, she fought, then you witnessed a rematch, a battle between oblivion and truth. Rome fell, but the idea of gladiators lived on, stubborn as an ancient meme. Where do you see them? On sports logos, in comics, on UFC rings, and sometimes in energy drink commercials. The image of the gladiator, muscular, silent, fearless of pain, has transcended the arena and entered the modern world's mind. Both men and women are called warriors in countless contexts, but always warriors by the standards of a dead empire. What about the gladiatrices? They're also being brought into the light, from academic books to cosplay at Comic-Con. In Japan, there's manga inspired by female gladiators. In Germany, museums are restoring images of Roman female warriors. In the US, female historians lead research on gender in ancient arenas. In Italy, there are even workshops teaching women to wield swords like in ancient times. It's not just reenactment, it's restoration. Because when you're erased from history, being remembered, even through cosplay, is an act of rebellion. In modern cultures, from music to cinema, Gladiatrix is no longer a curiosity, but a symbol. I was underestimated, and I survived. People say modern women are strong like warriors, but sometimes they don't need any metaphor. They are warriors. It's just, this era has no ancient arena to applaud them. Imagine a female gladiator standing in the arena, not to start the fight, but to end it. No cheers, just silent sand and late sunlight slanting on her shoulders. She drops her weapon, lifts her head, and for the first time, after so many years, is not called by the wrong name. You have walked with her since the first chapter, when she was just a shadow ignored by history. You have seen her overcome laws, language, prejudice, surpass even harsh scholars and tattered books. She fought, she survived, she left a mark, not by victory, but by undeniable presence. And you, whether wrapped in a warm blanket or awake at night with worry, have just lived alongside someone who once breathed hot breath into sand, sweat, and blood on a stage where the entire Roman Empire applauded, then forgot. The greatest speech in history, Alexander the Great and the Opis Rebellion. On a gloomy morning in the year 326 before the Common Era, a thin mist drifted lazily over the still water of an unfamiliar river. The place where Alexander had set foot after the bloody battle of Hydaspes, where his army had just defeated King Porus and his war elephants. The air still hung heavy with the musty scent of the jungle. Tropical insects buzzed in the humid space, and before them lay the Hyphasis River, not just a body of water, but a symbolic boundary between glory and limits, between the ideals of one man and the endurance of a collective. Just as the Hellespont once served as the gateway for Alexander to enter Asia with dreams of immortality, Hyphasis was the final threshold, where he realized that not all who started the journey with him would reach the end. The army had reached its ultimate limit, a blurred upstream branch in the Punjab region, called Hephaestus by the Greeks and ignored by the Indians. This was not a place marking a battle. The sky was heavy and overcast, morning light too faint to pierce the distant canopy. The ground was soaked, smelling of mouldy earth, rusty armor, and the warm sweat of thousands who hadn't bathed in weeks, all mingled into an oppressive atmosphere like the last breath of a dream of victory. No one spoke, only the soft clank of armor, the squelch of feet in mud, and the sound of insects unaware that the greatest empire in the world was pausing, right here. No spears, no blood, only a weary army and a king standing among them. Alexander the Great, then 32 years old, was at the peak of glory. His empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, from the Egyptian deserts to the icy peaks of the Hindu Kush. He had defeated Darius, destroyed the Persian Empire, crowned himself pharaoh at Memphis, founded Alexandria, and rewritten the map of Asia with his own footsteps. And now, he wanted to go further. Across the river lay lands no one had yet set foot on. He dreamed of the next conquest, through India to the Eastern Ocean, where mythology said the sun rose from the sea. But this time, no one followed him. Not because they betrayed him, not because they plotted assassination, but because they were exhausted, no longer had faith, no longer had dreams. They were the men who had marched with him for over 10 years. They had seized every city, crossed every desert, buried comrades beneath hot sand and cold snow. They had sworn loyalty. They had called him their king, and often their god. But now, on the bank of a nameless river, they bowed their heads, avoided his gaze, and said no. The historian Arrian recorded, Alexander summoned the soldiers and asked them, who still wanted to go on? No one stood. Not a single voice answered. The undefeated king, who had never lost a battle, faced his first defeat, being abandoned by his own army. No one knows how he felt at that moment, only that he did not draw his sword, did not shout, did not threaten. He stood and began to speak, and what he said became one of the most memorable speeches in ancient history, not for its lofty logic, but because it was the most human moment of a god, when he begged to go on, alone. From that nameless river, a new chapter began, not with blood, but with words. And that was the silent tragedy of one who conquered the world, but had no one left to follow to the end. To understand why those men, who once risked their lives for him, turned back at the very height, we must rewind the bloody path of sand, snow, and fire they traveled for over a decade. That journey not only wore down their shoes and bones, but also slowly faded the ideals they once believed. 11 years ago, when Alexander left Macedonia, he didn't just lead an army. He led a belief that it was possible to surpass every limit set for mankind. From Pella, he crossed the Hellespont like a living copy of Achilles, stepping into Asia with unwavering eyes and an unyielding dream. He didn't just fight, he carried an entire Greek civilization with him. In his hands were not only spears, but also language, art, laws, and what the Greeks called logos, reason, order, and light amidst the chaos of the East. But that light had to be conquered by blood. Throughout the journey, they defeated the Persians at Gaugamela, burned Persepolis, buried tens of thousands in Bactria, and built cities named Alexander across Central Asia. They crossed waterless deserts, the infamous Gedrosian Desert, where death came not by sword, but by thirst. The scorching heat drained every drop of sweat, every breath. Thousands died from exhaustion, unable to find a well, no tears left to shed. It was there Alexander learned geography was more ruthless than any army. They passed through the frozen Hindu Kush mountains, through the marshy swamps of Mesopotamia, and then they reached India, where elephants larger than dreams roamed, and the tropical rain fell endlessly, like the final test from the gods. By then, no one was the same. No longer Macedonian soldiers, Thessalian soldiers, or Thracian soldiers. Only walking corpses remained, carrying a history even they no longer recognized. Alexander was still king, but he was no longer human. For years he ate less than his soldiers, marched farther than his generals, led night raids himself, and was always the last to leave the battlefield. He slept little, rested less, and in his eyes there was always room for one more frontier. And that made him strange. To the army worn down by time, Alexander seemed no longer part of the living world. He was still king, but his followers had ceased to be believers. They were no longer an army with shared ideals, but scattered individuals carrying their own fragments. Some missed their wives, some mourned children, some had families in the eastern cities they had conquered. Some had been ennobled, given land, gold, and for the first time in their lives, something to lose They no longer wanted to march. They wanted to survive. And in silence, they began to ask, what are we still marching for? For whom? Beyond glory, beyond geography, beyond flesh, they had surpassed themselves, and all that remained after every limit was weariness. They didn't refuse out of fear, but because they no longer had enough of themselves left to believe in anything. Alexander reminded them, right in that silent speech at the Hyphasis, of what they once were and who he had made them into. They were once shepherds, men wrapped in animal skins, carrying flint in their belts, afraid of neighbors, and avoiding even the shadows in the Macedonian valleys. They had no cities, no schools, no ports. They had no written history. Macedonia was then considered a backwater compared to the Greek city-states, both wild and poor. Each tribe lived separately, fighting like wild wolves, frequently threatened by Illyrians and Thracians. Athens and Thebes, the centers of southern civilization, regarded Macedonians as rough brutes, unworthy to be called Greek. They lived by sheep and died by unnamed revenge. Then Philip, Alexander's father, arrived. He not only built an army, but rebuilt the concept of Macedonia. Philip restructured the army from the ground up, creating a 16-deep phalanx formation with sarissa spears up to 6 meters long, surpassing any weapon of that time. He trained soldiers year-round, paid professional wages, turning peasants into an organized war machine for the first time. But he didn't stop at military reform. He used marriage, diplomacy, and assassination to unite the wild tribes, transforming a fragmented borderland into a nation with collective will. From cold villages, he built cities. From illiterate men, he created administration. And from shepherds, forged soldiers. Alexander inherited them and pushed them into legend. From hill watchers, they became governors of Ionia. From dog herders chasing wolves, they became commanders of Egypt. From children afraid of forest nights, they held the treasure of Babylon. But in return, Alexander never slept, and he didn't let them sleep. He lived like a falling star, no stopping point, only a burning trajectory. He didn't celebrate victories, only map new lands. He never allowed a spring to pass without a campaign. To him, every dawn was not rest, but a new summons. A man like that does not live with time. He lives beyond it, and those left behind could not keep up. He led them relentlessly. Night was a good time to march. Noon was the time to fight. Dreams had no day off, so the road had no pause. They saw him awake, by the fire, over the map, beside his peeling golden helmet. No one ever saw Alexander yawn. No one ever saw him skip a meal. No one ever saw him leave the battlefield without leading. They say he was Achilles' successor, not for strength, but for loneliness. He read Homer every night, slept beside his sword and the epic. When his close friend Hephaestion died, Alexander wept as if half his soul was gone, then burned a whole city in mourning. A king who didn't cry before enemies, but collapsed before friendship, like Heracles by his lover's corpse. To his soldiers he was both myth, and the fear that the myth was real. To them he was not a king. He was time, cold, relentless, waiting for no one. That made them love him, then fear him, then wear out from him. No one betrayed Alexander. They just melted, like steel tempered in fire, like stone sharpened too long, like light too bright, making people close their eyes. In human history, there are leaders who kill to make others obey. Alexander didn't need to do that. He just had to keep walking and let those behind fall away. No god needs to justify his journey. But Alexander, in the first moment of solitude, spoke like a man. Before thousands of silent soldiers by the Hyphasis River, he did not rally. The historian Arrian, in Anabasis Alexandri, recorded that Alexander did not stand on a high platform, nor wear golden armor. He simply stepped into the circle of soldiers, unarmed, dust-covered. No flags flew, no war drum sounded. Only the wind swept across the Punjab plains, and a silence heavy as stone. Curtius Rufus, a Roman living 3 centuries later, wrote that he spoke not to command, but like a father calling his lost children home. No embellishment of new victories, no oaths or promises. He spoke of the past, the only thing that could hold them back. I do not stop you from going home, but before you leave, let me remind you who brought you from where and to where. It was not a speech. It was an inventory of glory, a chronicle in blood, where every land he conquered was a bullet point of proof. Like a 3-act play, Alexander began with origins, Philip and the birth of Macedonia. Next, he named the victories: Egypt, Babylon, Bactria, rivers and cities no one dared dream of before. Finally, he made it personal, no longer we, but I. A body scarred over scars, a man pouring himself out in exchange for others' loyalty. He began with his father, Philip, who turned them from shepherds into soldiers, from the fearful into the feared. Then he listed each conquest: Ionia, Egypt, Babylon, Phrygia, Persia, India, as if each name was a scar on their shared body. What do I keep for myself, besides this purple cloak and crown? Alexander did not only recall what he had given, wealth, land, titles, but also his sleep, meals, long nights guarding so they could rest. He spoke of wounds, each sword cut, each arrow, each stone, as proof he had bled with them, for them. Then his voice shifted from pride to pain. If you have scars, show me. I will show you mine. But those scars were not only on skin. They lived in his eyes when he spoke of the dead, in the hoarseness of his voice recounting lost cities. Some scars he could not point to, because they dwelled where words fail. The absolute loneliness of the one who leads, knowing all others have turned back. In that very moment, Alexander was no longer a statue-worthy king. He was a man, raw, abandoned in an unfinished dream. That speech did not look to the future, but clung to the past, like someone holding onto a loved one's sleeve as they leave the train. He did not command. He did not beg. He recounted and let the final silence answer. An eloquent account, a confession shaped like conquest, a last effort to hold them, not with swords, but memory. Unlike Pericles praising the fallen, or Caesar manipulating crowds with double-edged words, Alexander did not speak to be loved, nor to be obeyed. He spoke to not fall in loneliness, and that made his words heavy, not as orders, but as farewells no one wanted to hear. But sometimes, memories are not heavy enough to hold people back. They are only heavy enough to make leaving feel burdened. When Alexander spoke of scars, it was not just an image. It was a declaration. There were no scars on his back, because he had never turned his back in battle. Beside his soldiers, he rode into the first fight. At the Granicus River in the year 334 before the Common Era, he nearly died when a Persian general struck his head with a sword, if not for Clitus timely blocking the blow. When storming Tyre in the year 332 before the Common Era, he was hit by a stone to the skull, while climbing siege ladders. In the year 325 before the Common Era, during the battle with the Malians in the Multan region, an arrow pierced his chest, rendering him unconscious, believed dead. Yet Alexander was the first to climb the city walls. At Gaugamela, he broke the siege with the cavalry, cutting through the Persian lines, never once looking back. For Alexander, honor wasn't written in epics, but flesh, blood, and bone, placed before spear points. He did not need to proclaim himself a hero. His body spoke for him. Each scar was a map. On the shoulder, the Granicus battle in the spring of the year 334 before the Common Era, where water and blood blended as one. On the thigh, the exhausting march across the Gedrosian desert in the year 323 before the Common Era. On the chest, the arrow wound from the surprise fight with Bactrian rebels when Alexander suddenly entered the Central Asian mountains in the year 326 before the Common Era. When he opened his cloak, standing among thousands, the morning light shone on his skin. No one dared stare long, not because he was divine, but because he lived a life without turning his back. Leonidas fell with his shield still tightly held in hand. Achilles, the invincible, only fell because his heel never touched the battlefield. But Alexander, he had no heel, no weak spot, for his entire body was a statement. I am here, and I do not retreat. There are many ways to rule, by law, by wealth, by fear. But Alexander chose to lead with wounds, and perhaps that was the last thing he could do, when words no longer held others' steps. Use his own body, like a tattered flag, but never lowered. Alexander once called them brothers. They slept together in torn tents in Anatolia, shared half a pouch of hard rations in Egypt, and kept watchfires burning through nights in the Hindu Kush mountains. Some had shielded him from arrows. Some had carried him when he was unconscious. Some he personally appointed as satraps, gifting rings, land, and a piece of history. But at the Hephaestus River, in the summer of the year 326 before the Common Era, they looked at him like a stranger. General Conus, one of the closest and most loyal, stepped forward on behalf of the army. No shouting, no arguing, only bowed heads and words. Your Majesty, we have gone far enough. It was not a rebellion. It was a permission request, heavy as a farewell. Not because he changed, but because he did not stop. They, the Macedonian soldiers, began dreaming of home. Not because they feared battle, but because every day marching was one more day away from their original memories. Some dreamed of light through thatched roofs back home. Some missed the voice of a child they had never held. Each new victory only made clearer the distance between glory and peace. Alexander did not. He had no children, no home, no point to return to. The only thing he had was forward. When soldiers start to remember home, and the king still remembers the frontier, they are no longer comrades. No revolt, no overthrow, just a long silence. Then each stepped back, like receding tides. Alexander still stood there, like one too far from shore, no longer hearing the call from land. Not everyone who leaves betrays. Sometimes they leave because they once loved. Rome fell to overlong ambition. Napoleon stopped in Moscow's freezing grip. And Alexander, perhaps he went further than the heart one can carry. Some empires don't collapse because they're defeated, but because no one has the strength to go on. Returning home, they carried not spoils, but stories. The old soldiers came back to Macedonia with cracked knees, backs bent by armor, and eyes that had seen nameless rivers beyond deserts. None of them were historians, but each night by the fire, they were storytellers for a generation that had never seen Alexander, yet knew him through every scar and silent voice. In Pella, bronze statues began to rise, not just statues of the king. Bronze does not decay, and memory, when turned into statues, no longer depends on recall. Those statues stood, like metal lighthouses, deeply planted in their hometown squares, to remind villagers that once someone had stepped out of their narrow world, reaching the edges of the human map. There was the figure of a nameless soldier pulling a bowstring, the face of a cavalryman who died at Gaugamela, the bare feet of an Asian page who marched all the way to India. Those people, those lives thought lost to history, were now metal, standing tall in their hometown squares. Because Alexander did not forget, "I bury them with full honor." He once said that, and he truly did. According to historian Arians Anabasis Alexandri, Alexander ordered bronze statues erected for soldiers who died bravely. Plutarch, in Life of Alexander, recounts that many soldiers were granted lifelong tax exemptions and land upon returning. Not only generals, but also cavalrymen, archers, and pages, anyone who had bled for the army, were remembered as part of the empire. The fallen were not left behind. The survivors were freed from taxes for life, honored with statues, and had their names inscribed on city gates. This was not charity, it was loyalty. No Persian emperor ever erected a statue for a dead archer. No pharaoh ever inscribed a charioteer's name on a tombstone. But Alexander, who studied under Aristotle's shadow, understood that an empire does not stand by glory written on bronze plaques, but by memories held in the hearts of ordinary people. In a world where kings often forget the hands that lifted them to the throne, Alexander carved their names into stone, not because he needed their gratitude, but because he needed them remembered, because power, no matter how great, cannot stand on oblivion, but memory, if carved with loyalty and bronze, lives longer than any map. Alexander knew, an empire may fall, but if the names of its soldiers remain on city gates, its ideals have not died. A king who conquered the world, yet was only human, in the eyes of those who fought beside him. There were no rebels, no knives in the back, no defeat. Alexander did not die on the battlefield. He died in bed, in Babylon, in June of the year 323 before the Common Era. Death came like a fever, slow, steady, gnawing at every breath. Some say he was poisoned. Some say he caught a disease from the Mesopotamian marshes. But the truth is probably simpler. A body bearing too many scars, with no place left to bear another wound. Alexander passed after 12 days of high fever, delirium, and silence. No clear last words, no named successor. When generals asked, "To whom does the god want to leave the empire?" he only whispered, "To the most worthy." People often think death ends a life. But for Alexander, death began an earthquake. Generals fought over his legacy. The empire shattered into pieces. Friends turned into enemies. Loyalty became strategy. And the name Alexander, from one man, became a reason to kill, ally, erect statues, and write doctrines. But that's what made his ending not a failure, because no one fails when their death still shapes history. Alexander died while the peak of glory was still beneath his feet. Where he fell, the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, was once the heart of a different civilization. On the day he was dying, generals gathered, not on the battlefield, but in a tiled chamber where the old empire breathed its last. History, as if replaying an old tune, only with a different composer. There was no failed campaign before, no defeated empire, no fortress lost to the enemy. When he fell, the map still had no borders to the east, because he was still expanding it. He did not grow old. There was no decline, no betrayal or escape. Death came while the fire still burned fiercely in his eyes, and those around him hadn't yet believed that fire could be extinguished. No spear pierced his back, no funeral dirge, no farewell words. His death came quietly, like a trail of smoke after a great victory. And when the generals knelt around his bed, they lost not only their king, but their direction, because no one had ever imagined a world without Alexander. Some died too late. Alexander died too soon. But that is why he never grows old in people's memories. There are deaths that make us mourn. There are deaths that make history turn back. But there is one death that makes glory, never replaced. No one returned home with Alexander. No one carried his body across the desert. No traditional Greek funeral rites. No cremation. No farewell on Macedonian soil. The golden coffin carrying his remains was fought over like a treasure. Ptolemy, one of his closest friends and generals, secretly took Alexander's body to Egypt and buried him in Memphis. Later, the tomb was moved to Alexandria, the city bearing his name, but then disappeared amidst rebellions, conquests, and the sands of time. No one knows exactly where that tomb is. Alexander, who crossed every border, ended his life in a grave no one has found. The greatest man became the greatest mystery. But perhaps that was how he wanted it. Because a legend is not meant to be found, but to be told forever. And every time the story is told, Alexander lives again. Nero, Rome's Antichrist. An empire of more than 70 million subjects, a golden throne built on the ruins of a fallen republic, an emperor, only 16 years old. In October of the year 54, the Roman Empire, the pinnacle of Western power, woke up to see a boy seated on the throne. Not because he was a genius, not because he had heroic blood or exceptional military talent, but because he was his mother's final successful plan. His name was Nero. His birth name, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, born on December 15th, year 37, into a family soaked with blood and power, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. His mother, Julia Agrippina the Younger, was the niece of Augustus, the first emperor, the sister of Caligula, the assassinated emperor, the granddaughter of Tiberius, the emperor who exiled relatives and poisoned traitors. And finally, she became the wife of Claudius, the reigning emperor. Before Nero appeared, Rome was no stranger to palace intrigues. Claudius, the reigning emperor once mocked for his stutter and limp, suddenly rose to power in the year 41 after Caligula's assassination. Under his rule, Rome saw important administrative reforms, territorial expansion into Britannia, but also turmoil within the imperial family. Claudius married Messalina, a woman notorious for affairs and power struggles. After she was executed for treason, Claudius made a controversial move. He married his own niece, Julia Agrippina the Younger, in the year 49. This was not just a marriage, but a reshaping of the Julio-Claudian dynasty's future. When Agrippina brought her own son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, into the palace, she laid the groundwork for a shadow coup. From a disgraced exile, Agrippina rose to become Roman empress, not through loyalty, but through manipulation of court politics, controlling alliances, and most certainly removing any obstacles blocking her son's path. In February of the year 50, Claudius officially adopted Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus and renamed him Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. This was a strategic move, not only to legitimize his place in the royal family, but also to place Nero in the line of succession, even though Claudius still had a biological son, Britannicus. Immediately after adoption, Nero was included in state ceremonies, dressed in royal attire, and seated next to the emperor at public events. In the eyes of the court, the slender youth seemed destined to inherit the throne. From his mother, Nero inherited royal blood, but also something more dangerous, an obsession with survival in the palace. From the year 51, Agrippina pressured Claudius to publicly recognize Nero as heir, putting him on par with Britannicus, the emperor's biological son, along with honorary titles like princeps. Juventutis, leader of the youth, Nero appeared on imperial coins and held a reserved seat in the Senate. To prepare him for the throne, Agrippina summoned one of the era's most influential intellectuals, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, as Nero's official tutor. Seneca, a Stoic philosopher once exiled by Caligula to Corsica, had just been brought back by Agrippina in the year 49. Simultaneously, she appointed Sextus Afranius Burrus, a neutral figure, as commander of the Praetorian Guard. From there, these two powerful advisors shaped Nero's early reign. Weeks before Claudius died, Nero was still a boy neglected for years due to his mother's exile. He lived with a wet nurse. He was taught by a dancer, an insult to Roman nobility. He was considered a pawn in the game of power. And then, one by one, those who stood in his way fell, and he appeared on the throne. On October 13th, year 54, the aging Claudius collapsed after a feast. Rumors flew. His last mushroom dish was poisoned by Agrippina. Another rumor claimed the food taster was bribed. No evidence, only the result. Roman legend says that on the night Claudius was dying, Agrippina kept the news secret for hours. She cleared the banquet table, disinfected the bedchamber, and waited for dawn. During that time, Nero was thoroughly prepared. Royal robes, Praetorian Guard lined up, and an accession speech drafted by Seneca, his new tutor. At dawn on October 13th, while doubts and unrest spread, Agrippina stepped before the Praetorian camp, pointed at her son, and declared, "Here is the heir, chosen by Claudius, the one Rome will need." No one objected. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, was still a child. Seneca spoke for Nero, and the new reign began, in silence. Nero was declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard, a 16-year-old boy, old enough by law to be considered a man, never commanded an army, never spoken before the Senate, never studied the art of rule, but knew how to play the lyre and read Greek poetry. Many in the court whispered, "We're handing the empire to a child." No one dared say more, because his mother, Agrippina, stood right behind the throne. That day, Nero wore the crown, a crown woven by his mother's hands, stained by his stepfather's death, and built from the traditional fear of a dynasty killing each other to survive. The Romans loved power, but they also understood not everyone could bear the weight of a golden wreath, especially when it was given to a boy just growing a mustache. In ancient Rome, every child born into the Julio-Claudian family received two default gifts: a divine name and a bloody fate. Nero was no exception, but he was not the first. In the world of blood-stained thrones, children were tools, hostages, pawns. There was no childhood, no trust. Only two essential skills to learn before age 10: pretend and be silent. The Julio-Claudian family tree reads like a list of political murders. Tiberius, the second emperor, once poisoned his son-in-law to keep the throne. Caligula, his successor, killed dozens of royal family members, including his own siblings. Claudius, who seemed mild, executed 2 wives and did not hesitate to sentence his own nephew to death. Julia Agrippina, Nero's mother, grew up amid these purges. Her father, Germanicus, died mysteriously when Agrippina was a child. Her brother, Caligula, was assassinated in the year 41. Her mother died in exile. Agrippina herself was exiled, suspected of treason, only recalled after the death of Messalina, Claudius's former wife. That girl learned one vital lesson. In Rome, the blood of kin does not guarantee loyalty. It only guarantees risk. And that was the environment in which Nero was raised. Not in loving arms, but in the breath of survivors of backstabbing. The only person who showed care for Nero was his mother, but that love was always accompanied by calculation. From a young age, he was taught not how to rule, but how to avoid death. Avoid standing too close to the heir. Avoid eating before the emperor. Avoid speaking too much to the court. The first lesson Nero learned was not philosophy, but the lesson of a child in a family that killed its own to survive. In Rome, the concept of family among the powerful elite often did not mean blood ties, but a collection of fragile political alliances easily changed with the wind. When a father could order his son's death for suspected rebellion, when an empress could poison her husband to place her own son on the throne, the line between kinship and assassination was but a glance. Children in those families were not taught how to love, but trained to watch, remember, and choose sides at the right moment. This was the skill Agrippina learned as a child, and the skill she passed to Nero as an invisible dowry, taught not in words, but understood instinctively. If history had feelings, it would cringe every time a Julio-Claudian child cried out at birth. Even the seemingly safest children could not escape a cruel fate. Drusus, son of Tiberius, died suddenly after a meal, suspected poisoned by his wife on Sejanus's orders. Gaius Caesar, Augustus's grandson, died on the way back to Rome. Lucius Caesar was severely injured in a horse accident and never recovered. All 3 were designated heirs, and all 3 never sat on the throne. That left a lesson deeply etched in the memory of every royal child. Longevity was not thanks to good blood, but knowing when to hide, because that cry was often the opening note of a lifelong survival game, and Nero, though crowned, was still a child. Before entering the palace in the year 49, Nero lived under the guardianship of his aunt, Domitia Lepida, known for indifference and coldness. Throughout his childhood, he wasn't cared for by his mother, nor given a proper tutor. The only person who taught him to read and write was a professional dancer, a profession looked down upon in ancient Roman society. At that time, artists, dancers, and actors were just one step above slaves, banned from speaking in court and having no legal honor. Therefore, Nero learning from a dancer was not just neglect. It was a symbolic lowering, as if this boy was never expected to enter politics. a child taught that survival was the goal, and family was a fragile cover hiding a dagger behind the back. Therefore, Nero's accession at 16 was not just a political event. It was the final symbol of a generations-long cycle of killing each other, like a wreath woven from blood, passed hand to hand, not for glory, but for fear of destruction. In that wreath, each leaf was a body. Biological father Demeas died when Nero was 3. Messalina was executed. Claudius fell after a mushroom dish suspected to be poisoned. And now, the child who survived, not because he was the strongest, but because he was led by the one who understood the bloodstained rules of the Roman court best, Agrippina. October 13th, the year 54. A day without war, without meetings. An ordinary day, if you don't count that the Roman Empire had just lost its emperor. Claudius, who survived purges and was mocked for his stutter, collapsed after eating a plate of mushrooms. No obituary, no urgent summons. The palace fell into silence, a carefully orchestrated silence. Agrippina kept it secret. She locked the palace chambers, silenced the servants, and guarded Claudius's body through the night, not out of grief, but to prepare her son Nero's coronation. In the inner court, guards were replaced by Agrippina's loyalists. Some accounts say she immediately had everything that could leave traces destroyed, from tablecloths to wine cups. The head chef was summoned, and then disappeared. The atmosphere was like a stage rehearsal. The throne was the stage, and the emperor's body the last prop to be cleared away. Historian Tacitus wrote that Claudius died after eating a strange mushroom, known as food of the gods. But to Agrippina, it was the mushroom that led to political immortality. Some sources claim the food taster was bribed. Others say Claudius was only mildly poisoned, but Agrippina ordered the physician Xenophon to use a feather to induce vomiting, killing him in the process. No indictment, but one fact: Claudius did not survive that meal, and Nero was declared emperor the next morning. In the dark, Agrippina ordered her son dressed in purple robes, summoned the Praetorian Guard, and prepared the accession speech written by Seneca, his new tutor. In truth, Nero's rise was not just a mother's victory, but the result of a sophisticated alliance. Behind the scenes, two figures played key roles: Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the respected philosopher, and Sextus Afranius Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. They ensured Nero's legitimacy, the writer and the soldier. One gave him words to speak, the other strength to survive. Nero had never commanded anything, but everything was ready to run as if he was born to rule. At dawn, she stepped out of the palace, took her son's hand, and declared to the guards, "This is Claudius's son, the one he chose, the Emperor of Rome." No one objected. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, was still a child, not of legal age. However, Britannicus's presence was not forgotten. Though only about 13 at the time, he was Claudius's only legitimate son, and in the eyes of many senators, the rightful heir. Agrippina understood this well. She knew that just one slip, one more year until Britannicus reached adulthood by law, could tip the balance of power. That is why Nero's hurried coronation was not only a political move, but a preemptive strike, crushing any hope for a throne struggle from Claudius's own bloodline. Seneca read the speech. Nero nodded. The Praetorian Guard cheered. And so, a child became master of the world. Everything was perfectly arranged. Nero was recognized by the Senate that very day. New coins were minted with his portrait. The public was given free wheat. Gladiators performed in celebration. No official funeral for Claudius was held in time. Outside the palace, the Roman people reacted with tense silence. No uprisings, but no cries either. Merchants closed early. Street vendors stopped hawking. In the public baths, where rumors spread fastest, people whispered, "The empire has a new emperor, but the body of the old one is nowhere to be found." In the slave market, someone dared joke, "That body is probably rehearsing a new play for Seneca," and was dragged away. Rome might applaud a new dynasty, but Rome never forgets how it began, with a silent death, and a child handed a sword amid reluctant applause. Romans love tragic deaths. But this time, they only saw a carefully staged drama, with a mother backstage controlling every act. Many whispered, "If this is the beginning, what will the end be?" And they were right. That day, Rome lost not only an emperor, it lost the last illusion that the throne could be granted through loyalty. From then on, power was built on metal, and behind it, the hands of kin. There is an irony in Roman history. The early years under a teenage emperor are remembered as a rare peaceful period of the empire. From 54 to 59, Nero's first 5 years of reign, later historians called the Quinquennium Neronis, the Golden 5 Years. But here, we call it by a softer, more metaphorical name, the 5 years of velvet patches, because behind that calm was a velvet stage, where Nero sat on the throne, but the play was still written by others, the lines prompted by others, and the light still controlled from backstage. During this early reign, the two real rulers of Rome were Seneca, philosopher and tutor, and Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Meanwhile, Agrippina, the emperor's mother, never stepped more than a foot away from the throne. They formed a triangle of power. Seneca wrote speeches, advised politics, and controlled media. Burrus ensured the army's loyalty. Agrippina managed meetings and removed anyone daring to question Nero's legitimacy. Nero, then 16, did the only things he knew: read poetry, play the lyre, and smile at the right moments. Yet it was during this controlled period that Rome witnessed a series of humane reforms. Secret trials were halted, capital punishment was limited, taxes were reduced, slaves were protected with the right to report abuse. Bloody animal fights gradually gave way to Greek-style athletic performances. According to the Annales of historian Tacitus, even after being removed from imperial decisions, Agrippina continued to send private letters to generals and provincial officials, trying to maintain influence by invoking the title Mother of the Emperor. A handwritten document from the province of Syria shows that in early 59, Agrippina still signed letters to the army with the phrase Agrippina, Mater Augusti, causing confusion among many commanders caught between conflicting orders. This sparked rumors that she was plotting against her own son, though no direct evidence exists. But for Nero, that mere possibility was enough to trigger irreversible actions. Before Agrippina's assassination, the relationship between her and Nero had reached a breaking point. According to historian Suetonius, royal family disputes during this time often centered around appointments of officials, influence over the military, and control of decrees issued from the palace. Agrippina frequently opposed her son's orders if not approved by her, even openly criticizing Nero during a Senate session in late 57. One witness recorded, "The palace at that time did not have 2 dragon heads, but 2 tiger heads." This power struggle forced courtiers and generals to choose sides, creating dangerous polarization within the court. This was not merely a mother-son conflict, but a battle for power between two centers of authority in an unstable reign. The year 58 also marked another turning point. Agrippina was stripped of access to the imperial treasury. This was not only a political act, but a symbolic warning. She no longer holds the keys to the empire. Tacitus's chronicles record that Nero actively cut off not only his mother's power, but also the financial ties, which had been Agrippina's tool to manipulate the court. This escalated simmering tensions, leading to the Misenum shipwreck a year later, and climaxing with the assassination in March of 59. From then on, historians note a fact. Nero was the first emperor in ancient Roman history to kill his own mother on the throne he sat upon. Between the two most powerful women in the court, Agrippina and Poppaea Sabina, existed an undeclared war. One represented the past, royal blood, seasoned politician, the orchestrator of a whole accession. The other embodied a new Rome, youthful, seductive, unafraid to storm the center of power with beauty and ambition. At court banquets, Poppaea's gaze and Agrippina's sharp tongue became two swords clashing in every toast. Poppaea's presence was not just a personal threat to the mother, but a strategic danger to the position of the one who placed the crown. Thus, the palace became a battlefield, where two women needed no weapons, just looks and whispered words to tilt the throne. Anyone who places a crown on another's head must accept one thing. That crown can turn around and crush the very hand that gave it. And Agrippina, the woman who once controlled an empire, was no exception. From 58, Nero began to show he was no longer the confused 16-year-old boy. He not only recited speeches written by others, he began making laws. He knew how to respond to the Senate. He began saying no to his mother. In Agrippina's eyes, this was betrayal. In Nero's eyes, this was the first time he controlled himself. The tipping point was Poppaea Sabina, Nero's new lover, a sharp noblewoman, full of ambition and hatred for Agrippina. Poppaea not only wanted the emperor's heart, she wanted the throne. And to get it, Nero's mother had to be removed from the power picture. For the first time, Agrippina found herself excluded from meetings. The Praetorian Guard no longer obeyed her. Officials who once knelt before her now avoided her gaze. Whispers in the palace turned bitter. She's the emperor's mother, not the emperor. Pushed out of the palace, Agrippina moved to a villa in Misenum, by the sea, away from the light, close to memories. But she would not be quiet. She still had allies, family, and letters sent under cover of night. Nero, now ruling on his own, knew better than anyone. To escape that shadow, it had to be cut at the root. And the death of his mother, who once killed her husband to place her son on the throne, became the young emperor's final plan. In spring of 59, a ship was sent to bring Agrippina back from Misenum to the Bay of Naples as a sign of reconciliation. But when night fell, the ship capsized at sea. An accidental sinking, a botched plan. Agrippina did not die. She swam to shore, wounded but alive. When soldiers came asking, she only said, "Tell the emperor I survived, and I will come to him myself." Nero heard the news and understood. The chance was lost. No more hiding, no more pretending. He ordered, "Kill her." The executioner broke into the house. Legend says, upon realizing what was happening, Agrippina did not flee. She placed a hand on her belly, pointed there and said, "Strike me here, where the monster was born." On March 23, in the year 59, Agrippina, Nero's mother, was assassinated. Nero staged a fake scene, sent letters to the Senate announcing it was suicide. But Rome did not believe. No one believed. A child took the throne by his mother's hand, and then killed that very hand to keep it. From that day, Nero was no longer the guided boy. He was the emperor who killed his mother. A new symbol was born. No more velvet curtains, only blood and stage lights beginning to shine on the real man. Under Seneca's hand, the court became rarely wise. However, beneath that peace, whispers circulated. A young emperor, never having commanded battles, banning beast hunts and cutting taxes for farmers. This won the common people's love but stirred suspicion among the nobles. Especially Nero's favouring of Greek culture, from theatre and poetry to openly showing off his singing, sparked whispers of one bringing shame to Augustus's legacy. Rome did not hate an artist. They only feared when that artist wore the crown. Nero's speeches, though not his own writing, pleased the Senate. Provinces gained more autonomy. Currency stabilized. And strangely, the empire was peaceful. But no velvet curtain, no matter how soft, remains untearable. Nero began to grow, began to be curious, began to tire of the role. He wanted to play music publicly, considered disgraceful for an emperor. He became passionate about poetry, theatre, and women beyond his mother's control. One of them was Poppaea Sabina, a love that would change an entire reign. And Agrippina, she was not used to being ignored. She had once controlled an emperor. She would not accept being the mother of a boy growing ideas of his own. So the thick velvet curtain was stretched tight. The first tears appeared, where power, art, desire, and fear clashed. And from then on, the Romans no longer called Nero the guided boy. They began calling him the monster who played the lyre. July 18, 64 after Christ, a sultry summer night in Rome. A small spark flared up from the Circus Maximus market. No one noticed. The wind from the Tiber blew strongly. The fire spread through wooden houses, narrow streets, and soon became the largest fire in Rome's history. 9 days, 14 districts, 7 completely burned to the ground. When Rome was on fire, Nero was not in the city. According to historian Tacitus, he was at Antium, a seaside villa. When he heard the bad news, he immediately returned, organized relief efforts, opened the palace to refugees, and used the treasury to rebuild the city. But no one remembers those things. What people remember is an unproven story. Nero standing on the palace roof, dressed in stage costume, playing the lyre, and reciting Greek poetry while Rome burned in a sea of flames. No one knows who started the fire, but some needed someone to blame. And Nero, in the eyes of the nobility and conservatives, an eccentric emperor, fond of theatrics, dressed in Greek style, loving poetry more than politics, became the perfect target. To escape pressure, Nero chose a scapegoat, a small, strange, unpopular community, the first Christians in Rome. According to Tacitus, he had hundreds arrested, tortured, and executed on charges of arson. They were crucified, burned alive, and even fed to wild beasts in public spectacles. At night, Nero used their bodies as living torches to light the imperial gardens. This was the moment historians call the first step sliding into madness. After his mother's death, Nero had no one to restrain him. After the fire, he had nothing left to save face. From a young artist beloved by the people, Nero began to act as if he were the lead character in an endless play. He took the stage, playing the goddess of childbirth. He married a boy named Sporus, who looked exactly like his deceased wife, after having him castrated and dressing him in a wedding gown. He held debauched festivals, went around singing throughout the city, and forced nobles to sit and praise. Romans were no strangers to madness, but madness had rules. Madness like Caligula still feared the Senate, but Nero, at this point, feared no one but oblivion. As the empire fractured, he built the Domus Aurea, the gigantic golden palace, on the very land that had burned. In the courtyard was an artificial lake. The dining room rotated. The ceiling could rain flowers. In the center stood a 35-meter bronze statue of himself. Some sources record that after this fire, Nero declared to the people that a new Rome will rise from the ashes. And indeed, his reconstruction plans contained many revolutionary elements. Streets were widened, fire prevention regulations implemented, and building materials strictly controlled. However, the symbol that caused him to lose everything was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, built on the ruins of Rome's poorest neighborhoods. The complex covered nearly 50 hectares, with golden main halls, artificial lakes, and the giant 35-meter statue, the Colossus Neronis. To Romans struggling through the disaster's aftermath, he was no longer emperor, but a self-proclaimed god, standing and laughing on the ruins. What truly terrified the nobility and ancient Roman historians was not the luxury, but the way Nero redefined the emperor's role. In traditional thinking, the emperor was the guardian of morality, the embodiment of pietas, reverence for the gods and Roman tradition. But Nero, in the eyes of men like Suetonius and Tacitus, broke every limit. He dressed as a goddess on stage, claimed to be the source of art, and even declared that the suffering of the people inspires poetry. Nero placing the Colossus statue at the center of the Domus Aurea, so tall it could be seen from anywhere in the city, was unprecedented. It made his image no longer human, but a bronze god to be worshipped, not as a symbol of authority, but of self-obsession. People lost their homes. He built a dream. From then on, Nero's image became linked with fire, with the stage, and with a question that puzzles posterity. Was he truly mad, or just an artist living in the wrong era? Whatever it was, Rome still burned, and an empire, once undefeated, can fall because of one man who could not stop performing. Among Nero's strangest and most disturbed relationships, none is more shocking than the name Sporus, a teenage boy. A victim, a copy, a queen forced to wear a veil, a wedding ring, and live beside Nero as if he had never been an ordinary child. In 65 AD, after the death of Poppaea Sabina, the pregnant wife whom Nero reportedly beat to death in a fit of rage, the emperor seemed to slip into a dangerous psychological state, a mixture of remorse and obsession. Poppaea, once loved wildly by him, the woman who made him kill his ex-wife Claudia Octavia to marry her, suddenly died before bearing his child. After killing her, Nero showed no public remorse, but according to historian Suetonius, he embalmed Poppaea's body, placed her in a marble tomb, and frequently visited her corpse, speaking to and admiring her as if she was still alive. However, what chilled people was not the grief of a man who lost his wife, but his next act. Shortly afterward, Nero encountered Sporus, a youth described as uncannily resembling Poppaea. No one knows who Sporus's parents were or where he came from, only that he was castrated on the emperor's orders. This act shocked not only on humanitarian grounds, but also culturally in ancient Roman society, where masculinity was tied to the concept of virtus, courage, honor, and manliness. Castration meant losing social status, personal honor, and full citizenship rights. To the nobility, Nero marrying a castrated youth and forcing him to play the role of empress was a terrifying reversal of Roman patriarchal order, a direct challenge to the deeply rooted gender and political structures of the empire. According to Cassius Dio, Historia Romana, Book 63, Nero called Sporus his wife and held a public wedding ceremony complete with dowry and witnesses. This ritual was not a one-time event. It was repeated on journeys to Greece and Asia Minor, where Nero carried Sporus like a real empress. He rode beside him in the chariot, crowned him, and gave him the title Augusta, normally reserved for Rome's official empress. Not long after, a strange wedding took place. Sporus, no longer a boy, wore a wedding dress, a veil, and a wedding ring given by Nero. At festivals, Nero called him Poppaea. He sat beside Nero like a queen, not as a symbol of power, but as a ghost resurrected from obsession. Accounts from Cassius Dio and Suetonius recount that in public performances, Nero dressed as a goddess, impersonated Poppaea, and reenacted childbirth scenes, as if self-punishing or self-torturing through theatre. At banquets, he forced nobles to praise the beauty of the new empress, calling Sporus Augusta, the sacred title for the empress. Some modern historians suggest Nero was not simply insane. He was wielding the emperor's absolute power to reenact a pain he could not undo. But in doing so, he destroyed the line between person and role, between love and violence. Sporus never had a voice. He left no letters. No one recorded his words. The only thing left is a tragic ending. After Nero's death in 68 AD, Sporus fell into the hands of the succeeding emperor, Vitellius. According to Cassius Dio, Vitellius planned to stage a mock play called The Wedding of Hades and Persephone, in which Sporus, playing the bride, would be publicly raped as a sick form of entertainment. Before this could happen, Sporus took his own life. A silent death, like his entire silent life. He embodied a play Nero wrote to satisfy a broken part of his soul. In Roman history, there were no shortages of emperors obsessed with power, but Nero was the first to use that power to recreate reality through his own tragedy. Golden palaces, spotlight, bronze statues, all merely the backdrop. Sporus, the true lead in a play no one was allowed to leave. In the next chapter, we will see what happens when the audience tires of the stage, when the Senate, the army, and the people simultaneously drop the curtain. In 68 AD, Nero ordered a tax increase in the province of Gallia Lugdunensis, a seemingly harmless move for an empire draining its treasury on banquets, palaces, and blood. But in that distant province, Governor Gaius Julius Vindex, long discontented, no longer wanted to bow. He rebelled, not in his own name, but in the name of another, Servius Sulpicius Galba, a veteran general governing Hispania. At first, Galba panicked. He had no intention of rebellion. But when Nero accused Galba of treason, all escape routes closed. On April 3rd, 68 AD, Galba officially declared defiance. Rome heard the news like a flash of light. Nero, once praised for cutting taxes, was now hated for burning the city, marrying a eunuch, killing his mother, killing his wife, and singing while people starved. Even the loyal Praetorian Guard was shaken. One by one, provincial governors and generals began sending letters congratulating Galba. The climax came in June 68, when the Senate, once a docile puppet, officially stripped Nero of the title emperor, declaring him hostis publicus, enemy of the state. Across Rome, people hurried to tear down Nero's statues from public squares, smashed plaques bearing his name, and erased all inscriptions honoring him. Stone statues once glorifying him were pulled down with ropes. Altars before the Temple of Jupiter, where prayers had been said in his name, now stood silent as if no emperor by that name had ever existed. Immediately, the Praetorian Guard accepted bribes from Galba's faction, betrayed Nero, and opened the city gates to the rebels. This was the first time since Augustus that the Praetorians, the ultimate symbol of loyalty, turned their backs on a living emperor. They not only opened the gates, but actively arrested Nero's close officials, confiscated documents, and removed imperial emblems from the barracks walls. With this move, the entire power structure in Rome collapsed overnight. The empire suddenly felt cold, as if the emperor's cloak had been stripped from a statue of a god. Inside the palace, Nero woke up and realized no one was left. No soldiers, no courtiers, no secretaries, no flatterers to wake him with the familiar praise, Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Only a few loyal slaves remained, and a shadowy figure lurking in the garden. Death, no longer an offstage presence. The marble halls were now empty, morning light shining on walls that once held his portraits, now just empty frames. A lost peacock wandered the garden, once a royal symbol meant to evoke divine power, now stray among weeds. Rome no longer called his name, and Nero, for the first time, no longer called himself emperor. Draped in a black cloak carrying a dagger, he fled. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, he wrapped himself in linen and straw, lying in a villa's cellar like a corpse hiding from his own funeral. At times, he muttered final words for his tombstone. Here lies Rome's greatest artist. When soldiers approached, he begged his servant to kill him before he was captured and humiliated in public. 4 miles outside Rome, he hid in the villa of a freedman named Phaon. Every time he heard distant hoofbeats, he asked, "Are they coming?" Then laughed. "I'm still alive. History goes on." But at dawn on June 9th, 68 AD, senators' men surrounded the villa. In despair, Nero placed the dagger at his throat, hands shaking, unable to end it himself. A slave had to help him plunge the blade deeper. His last recorded words, according to Suetonius, "Qualis artifex pereo?" What an artist dies in me. That death ended not only a life, but also the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the bloodline that produced Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. After Nero, the empire plunged into chaos. 4 emperors in 1 year. Yet none, brutal or great, inspired both fear and fascination as Nero did. An emperor who never truly wanted to be emperor. An artist, lost within his own tragedy. No invading army crossed the borders. No foreign general captured the capital. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first bloodline of Roman emperors, died not by war, but from a crack within. Not a glorious death, but a form of rot, where walls that seemed solid slowly cracked from the foundation. Like a tree hollowed out inside, even the slightest breeze could bring it down. The crack was named family. From Augustus to Nero, The empire was extended not by swords, but by marriage, assassination, and blood kinship. They married sisters, killed brothers, poisoned uncles, and adopted heirs. That dynasty stood not on loyalty, but on fear. No one was allowed to heir, and everyone could be replaced. When Nero committed suicide on June 9th, 68 AD, no one bearing the true blood of Julius Caesar or Augustus sat on the throne. That blood had been worn away by internal intrigues. Drusus, son of Tiberius, poisoned. Britannicus, son of Claudius, died suddenly after a banquet. Germanicus, Claudius's brother, lost amid suspected murder. Those deaths did not come from external enemies, but from the very dining table, from handshakes over poisoned wine. That blood was drained by their own hands, drop by drop, generation by generation. The fall of a dynasty is usually linked to war, but the fall of the Julio-Claudians came from absolute isolation. No one mourned, no one resisted, no campaign restored that legacy, only silence. Roman historians also noted there was no order for mourning, no memorial service. No one dared invoke Nero's name at ancestral altars. In a capital once famed for loyalty to the Caesar family, this silence rang out like a requiem without music. Even Galba, Nero's successor, dared not mention his name in initial decrees. Later, historians, like Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, wrote about that end as a relief. An empire once built by Augustus's talent, by Tiberius's laws, by Caligula's madness, by Claudius's calculation, and by Nero's illusions, and once sustained through religious symbols, army oaths, and sacred rites before the temple of Jupiter, all now reduced to ashes. No one dared swear before his name. Judges were silent. Rituals were cancelled because no one claimed to preside for a dynasty rejected by the gods. Ended in a shabby villa, with a final confession in ancient Greek: "What an artist dies in me." Rome entered 69 AD without a clear heir. New statues were not yet erected. New coins were not yet minted. Though Nero was dead, the empire was like a brainless body, moving randomly, aimlessly. The silence in the days after his death echoed like an empty room, resonating endlessly with no answer, no king, no succession law, no central symbol. Only one question remained among the people. If the blood of Caesar is gone, then who will rule Rome? He died alone. No state funeral, no relatives, no eulogy. But Nero, once rejected by all of Rome, did not vanish like the forgettable. On the contrary, he became a symbol. Just months after Nero's death, rumors began to spread that he was still alive. From eastern Rome to Egypt, people spoke of a beggar with a mournful voice claiming to be Nero. At least 3 impostors sparked rebellions under the banner of Nero's return, gathering insurgents and declaring the restoration of the throne. By the 2nd century AD, poet Lucan still wrote about the ghost of the restless emperor. In Asia and the Balkans, people secretly built altars, placed cups of wine and a lyre, as if fearing the artist emperor would return and need something to continue singing. Why does a man erased from stone inscriptions, hated by both the Senate and the Church, live so long in collective memory? The answer lies in the danger of a symbol. Nero embodied everything Romans despised: decadence, chaos, offense to gods and laws. But he also embodied everything Romans yearned for: absolute freedom, singing in the night, the right to live outside the rules. No one dared love him openly, but no one dared forget him. Later, Christian believers wrote in Revelation of a seven-headed beast rising from the abyss, a symbol of Nero's return from death. In medieval art, Nero seated on a throne amid hellfire became a symbol of unlimited power, consumed by its own ambition. Under emperors like Domitian and Commodus, people whispered, "Here comes another Nero." He became the measuring stick for evil, a shadow always present in every succeeding regime. Nero is a legacy no one claims, yet no one discards. He reminds Rome that no matter how great an empire is, it can be turned into a theatre by a ruling child. He makes history more human, full of mistakes, missteps, tragedy, and a thirst to be heard. No one loves Nero, but anyone who understands history must pass by that name, if only to shudder.